Everyone thought he was nothing but a stray boy, too small to matter, too weak to last. They laughed when he claimed he'd face the wild chestnut stallion no rider could survive. But the moment the boy stepped into the dust, silence fell. What happened next would shake the ranch, expose hidden scars, and prove that sometimes the most broken souls forge the strongest bond. The afternoon sun hung low over the rolling plains of Montana, turning the tall grass into rivers of gold that swayed with the dry wind. A lone figure trudged along the dirt road leading toward Silver Creek Ranch, his small boots kicking up swirls of dust. Ethan Miller, barely 13, carried a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, its fabric frayed and stained from months of wandering. His shirt was too big for his wiry frame, his jeans torn at the knees, but his eyes storm gray with a hint of green burned with a stubborn light. He had walked for days, surviving on scraps of bread and water drawn from streams, until the sound of whinnying horses and the faint clang of metal against wood guided him here. From behind a line of weathered fences, he caught sight of the ranch, wide corrals filled with restless horses, barns painted in peeling red, and a white farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. The smell of hay, leather, and dust reached him before he stepped through the open gate. For Ethan, the ranch felt less like salvation and more like the last chance before hunger swallowed him whole. The first eyes that met him belonged to Cole Dawson, the ranch foreman. A tall man with a scar cutting across his jaw, Cole looked Ethan up and down and smirked. "What's this? Another stray puppy wandered in?" he said loud enough for the nearby workers to hear. A few men chuckled, their laughter carrying through the corral. Ethan, used to stares and cruel words since his father's accident in the mines and his mother's illness, simply straightened his back. "I can work," Ethan said, his voice calm but steady. "I'll do whatever needs doing. I don't need much, just food and a place to sleep." Cole barked a laugh and shook his head. "Kid, we've got men here who can barely handle this place. You think we're taking in a boy who looks like he can't lift a bucket of water?" The men laughed again, though one or two exchanged glances of mild pity. From the porch of the farmhouse, another figure appeared, Mr. Harrison, the ranch owner. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but his presence was undeniable. He was a man who measured everything in value: cattle, land, horses, and even people. He studied Ethan for a long moment, then said, "Let him earn his bread, if he can." His voice was clipped, decisive, the kind that brooked no argument. Relieved, Ethan nodded, but before he could thank him, a sound tore through the air, a shrill, angry neigh that seemed to shake the ground itself. Workers rushed to the fence, muttering nervously. In the far corral, a massive horse reared on its hind legs, its muscles gleaming under the sun like bronze fire. Its coat was a rich chestnut red, burning brighter where the sunlight caught its back, while its dark mane whipped wildly like a storm-tossed flag. Its hooves struck the wooden rails with such force that the boards rattled. "That's Thunderbolt," Cole muttered, his mocking grin replaced with something darker. "Meanest beast in Montana. Sent 3 good riders to the doctor in less than a month." Ethan's eyes locked on the horse. His chest tightened not with fear, but with something he hadn't felt in months. It was as if the animal's fury mirrored the storm inside him, the loneliness he carried since his world had fallen apart. For a moment, the noise of the men around him faded. All he could see was the chestnut stallion pawing the ground, its black eyes burning with defiance. "Keep your distance, kid," one of the ranch hands warned. "That devil will crush you before you get close." But Ethan didn't look away. The laughter, the doubts, the warnings, they all blurred into the dry wind. He felt his pulse steady, his breath deepen. "I'm not afraid of him," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. Cole, standing nearby, caught the words and laughed again, louder this time. "Hear that, boys? The pup thinks he can handle Thunderbolt." More laughter echoed across the ranch, sharp and dismissive. But Mr. Harrison didn't laugh. He leaned against the porch post, arms folded, eyes narrowing at the strange boy who dared to look straight at the most dangerous horse he'd ever owned. Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack, his gaze never leaving Thunderbolt. Dust swirled around his boots as the stallion struck the ground again, sending another shudder through the fence. "I'll work here," Ethan said, his voice firm now, "and one day I'll walk into that corral. Not to fight him, but to stand with him." The ranch fell silent for a beat before the men erupted with fresh laughter, shaking their heads at what they thought was childish foolishness. But above the noise, Thunderbolt's ears flicked forward, his dark gaze fixed on the boy at the gate, as if he, too, had heard the promise. The morning light spread across the valley like a pale gold river, breaking through thin layers of mist that clung to the grass. Silver Creek Ranch stirred awake, with the sounds of boots crunching gravel, ropes slapping against posts, and the low rumble of cattle from the far fields. Ethan, still carrying the dust of yesterday on his clothes, found himself standing near the main corral with a broom in his hand. The handle was rough, splinters biting into his palms, but he worked without complaint. For food and a bed of hay in the barn loft, he would endure much worse. Cole Dawson leaned on the rail, chewing a stalk of dry grass, watching Ethan sweep with undisguised amusement. "Look at him," Cole called out to the other ranch hands, his voice dripping with derision. "The boy says he's not afraid of Thunderbolt. Maybe he thinks the broom is enough to tame him." His laughter set off a chain of chuckles among the men. Their voices rose above the morning clatter, echoing across the ranch. The teasing stung, but Ethan kept sweeping. Dust rose in clouds, clinging to his hair and shirt, yet he pressed on as if the broom were his shield against the ridicule. When he finally looked up, his gaze drifted toward the far corral. There Thunderbolt stood, muscles rippling beneath his chestnut coat, mane whipping across his neck. The stallion's ears twitched, catching every sound. His eyes were sharp, restless, and every inch of him radiated power untamed. The workers had gathered, leaning over the fence like spectators at a sideshow. One of them, Hank, a broad man with arms like logs, spat into the dirt. "Kid, that horse will crush you like an insect. Don't go pretending you've got some kind of magic," another added. 3 men with years of riding under their belts tried. One broke his collarbone, another's ribs, the third hasn't set foot near a horse since. "You think you'll be different." Their words were meant to shut him down, but Ethan lifted his chin. He had been dismissed before at the mines where his father once worked, in the small town where his mother's sickness had left him begging odd jobs to survive. Every sneer, every shake of the head only built a quiet defiance in him. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't blind. He simply saw something in Thunderbolt no one else seemed willing to see. Not just fury, but fear buried deep in the stallion's movements. Mary Lou, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, emerged from the kitchen doorway. She frowned at the gathering crowd, then at Ethan standing stiff and silent. "Leave the boy be," she said, her voice firm, though not unkind. "Work's work, and he's not hurting anyone." The men quieted for a moment, but only long enough for Cole to grin wider. "You hear that, Ethan?" Cole mocked. "Mother Mary's come to save you. You'd best stick to sweeping and leave the real work to men." Laughter erupted again, but beneath the noise, a sharp, piercing neigh cut through the air. Thunderbolt reared, his front hooves slicing the sky, his mane catching the sunlight like streaks of fire. The men hushed, gripping the rail as the chestnut beast crashed down with a thunderous impact that shook the ground. Dust flew, wings of earth rising around him as he pawed at the dirt, his nostrils flaring. Even from across the yard, the force of him was undeniable. Ethan's broom slipped from his hand. For a fleeting second, the world seemed to narrow. The laughter, the jeers, even the voice of Mary Lou vanished into the background. All he heard was the stallion's breathing, steady and defiant, like a drumbeat echoing inside his chest. Thunderbolt turned his head, and his dark eyes locked with Ethan's. The moment was electric. The boy did not flinch. He did not look away. Something passed between them, something that none of the men, with their ropes and spurs, could recognize. Cole caught the glance and snorted. "Look at him, staring like he's found a friend. That horse doesn't make friends, kid. He'll tear you apart." But his voice, though mocking, carried an undertone of unease. For just a second, Cole had seen it too. The stallion had stopped thrashing when his eyes met Ethan's. The men muttered among themselves, some dismissing the moment as coincidence, others exchanging wary looks. Mary Lou wiped her hands again, her gaze softening as she watched Ethan. She saw something in the boy's quiet posture that the others missed. A patience, a steadiness rare in men twice his age. Ethan bent down, picked up the broom, and resumed sweeping. His movements were calm, deliberate, as though nothing had happened. Yet his heart pounded, each beat, whispering a truth only he could hear. He had not imagined it. Thunderbolt had recognized him, if only for an instant. By midday, the ranch settled back into its rhythm. The workers dispersed to the fields, Cole muttering about useless strays, and Mary Lou called Ethan into the kitchen to hand him a warm biscuit. He ate quietly, savoring the taste of butter and flour luxuries he hadn't had in weeks. She touched his shoulder gently. "Don't let them break you, child," she murmured. "There's more to strength than swinging a rope." That night, as the sun dipped below the mountains and painted the sky in streaks of crimson and violet, Ethan climbed the loft ladder to the hay where he slept. The smell of horses drifted through the slats, earthy and sharp. He lay on his back, staring through the cracks in the roof at the first stars blinking to life. Below, Thunderbolt moved restlessly in his corral, his chestnut coat glowing faintly in the dying light. Ethan whispered into the darkness, though no one was there to hear, "One day, they'll see you like I do." The wind carried his words across the pasture, and though it might have been his imagination, the stallion stilled, lifting his head toward the barn as if listening. The following morning dawned clear and sharp, the air crisp with the smell of pine drifting down from the mountain ridge. The ranch workers were already in motion, their shouts and the steady pounding of hooves echoing across the yard. Ethan slipped into the routine as best he could, sweeping, hauling water, fetching tools when asked. His body ached, but the ache felt different from hunger or loneliness. It was the ache of belonging somewhere, even if only at the edges. Still, the shadow of laughter from the previous day lingered in every sidelong glance. Mr. Harrison emerged from the farmhouse as the sun struck the corrals with a blaze of light. He was a tall man, with silver threaded through his dark hair, his boots polished, his coat pressed sharp despite the dust that clung to everything else. Where Cole was rough and blunt, Harrison carried himself with quiet calculation. His eyes, pale and unyielding, swept across the ranch like a man counting coins rather than souls. Every detail of the property, the horses, the cattle, even the men working, was a column in his ledger, each assessed for profit or loss. That morning, his attention fixed on Thunderbolt. The chestnut stallion prowled the corral like a caged storm, muscles rolling under his coat, eyes fierce. He threw his weight against the rails, testing them, sending a vibration through the ground with every strike. Harrison's jaw tightened as he watched. He had paid dearly for the horse, drawn by whispers of unmatched bloodlines, a creature built for speed and strength. Yet since the day Thunderbolt arrived, the animal had been nothing but a bleeding wound on his balance sheet. 3 riders down, one nearly dead, Harrison muttered under his breath, his voice low but edged with frustration. Worthless, unless he bends. His gaze narrowed as if by sheer force of will he could turn the stallion into an asset. Cole appeared at his side, arms crossed, smirk never far from his lips. "Should have cut your losses weeks ago," Cole said. "That horse is bad from the inside out. Sell him off for meat before he kills another man." Harrison didn't reply immediately. His eyes traced the scars hidden beneath Thunderbolt's dark mane, faint but undeniable. The stallion had known cruelty long before Silver Creek. That much was obvious even to Harrison, though compassion had no place in his calculations. He thought only of what it meant for his investment. "No," he said finally, cold and deliberate. "A horse with those lines won't be wasted. He'll be broken, one way or another." Ethan had been standing near the pump, filling buckets, but his ears caught every word. He froze, water sloshing onto his boots, his stomach knotting. The thought of Thunderbolt slaughtered like common stock made his chest tighten. He looked at the stallion pacing the corral, nostrils flaring, and felt a surge of something fierce rise in him. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to stop it. Mary Lou arrived with a tray of coffee and biscuits, her eyes narrowing at the tension between Harrison and Cole. She set the tray down on a rail and gave Ethan a quick glance. Her look said what words didn't: "Keep your head down." Yet Ethan's grip on the bucket tightened. Silence had kept him alive this long, but now silence felt like betrayal. "Sir," Ethan said, his voice steady though his hands trembled, "Thunderbolt isn't just wild. He's scared. He can learn, he just needs time." The words fell into the yard like stones into water. The men nearby stopped what they were doing, stunned that the boy had spoken up. Cole barked a laugh. "You hear that? The pup thinks he's a trainer now." He stepped closer, looming over Ethan. "You know nothing about horses, boy. Nothing." Harrison, however, didn't laugh. He studied Ethan the way a banker studies a risky loan, curious, but skeptical. "And you?" Harrison asked slowly. "What makes you so sure?" Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't have the words for the connection he'd felt in Thunderbolt's gaze, the quiet understanding that had passed between them. "Because I saw it," he said finally. He stopped when he looked at me. Just for a second, he listened. The silence stretched. Cole scoffed loudly, shaking his head. "Coincidence? The kid's got dirt in his brain, but Harrison's eyes lingered on Ethan, pale and calculating. A boy with nothing, daring to contradict him in front of his men. There was either foolishness in that, or something worth exploiting. "Let him try," Harrison said at last. His voice was flat, without warmth, but it silenced Cole's protests. "If the boy gets himself trampled, then we lose nothing. If he manages to calm the horse." He trailed off, the faintest smile curving his mouth, the smile of a man who had found a new angle. "Then maybe this mistake of an investment pays off after all." Ethan felt the weight of every eye on him. His throat went dry, but he nodded. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the thought of Thunderbolt's rage or the cold satisfaction in Harrison's tone. Yet when he glanced back toward the corral, Thunderbolt stood with ears pricked forward, watching him. The boy drew a slow breath. Whatever lay ahead, he knew this much: he and the stallion were bound now by something no one else could measure in numbers. The corral was a circle of dust and tension that afternoon, its wooden rails creaking under the weight of men leaning forward to watch. A storm of whispers rippled among them, bets made in murmurs, doubts thick in the air. The sun glared from a cloudless sky, burning white against the chestnut sheen of Thunderbolt's coat. The stallion's nostrils flared, each breath a sharp burst that stirred the dust. His hooves struck the ground in restless beats, a living drum echoing his fury. "Mister," Harrison stood at the fence, his hat low over his calculating eyes. Cole Dawson was beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight, his smirk gone now, replaced with a tension he refused to name. Mary Lou, hands pressed to her apron, whispered a prayer beneath her breath. And in the open gate stood Ethan Miller, barefoot now, his boots discarded, the broom long forgotten. He stepped forward with no rope, no saddle, no weapon, only the steady rhythm of his own breathing. The first step was the hardest. The men expected Thunderbolt to charge, to crush the boy with a single strike. Even Harrison, who had allowed this spectacle, leaned forward with the cold curiosity of a gambler watching dice roll. But Ethan did not stride toward the stallion. He moved slow, deliberate, and then stopped. He lowered himself to the ground, legs crossed, palms open on his knees, as though the dust itself were his seat of power. A ripple of confusion passed through the men. Cole let out a derisive bark of laughter. What's he doing, meditating? Yet the laughter died quickly, smothered by the silence settling over the corral. It was as if the earth itself held its breath. Birds stilled in the nearby cottonwoods. Even the cattle lowing in the distance grew faint. The only sound was Thunderbolt's heavy breathing and the faint rustle of his mane in the hot breeze. Thunderbolt's ears flicked forward, his muscles bunched like coiled springs, ready to launch into violence. But the boy didn't move, didn't even flinch. He sat as though carved from the dust, his gaze locked steady on the stallion without challenge, without fear. Slowly, Thunderbolt began to circle. His hooves kicked up spirals of dirt as he traced wide arcs around Ethan, the whites of his eyes flashing, teeth bared in warning. Still, the boy remained still. Minutes passed, stretching into an eternity measured only by hoofbeats and heartbeats. Sweat trickled down Ethan's brow, but his chest rose and fell in calm rhythm. When Thunderbolt halted suddenly, pawing the ground with one furious hoof, a murmur rippled from the fence. "He's about to strike," someone hissed. But Thunderbolt did not strike. He snorted, shaking his head, then shifted closer, narrowing the circle. Dust coated Ethan's shirt, clung to his hair, yet his expression did not falter. His lips moved, soft words slipping into the silence, not loud enough for the men to hear, but words meant for the stallion alone. "You're not alone," he whispered. "I know what it feels like." Something shifted. The stallion's ears swiveled, catching the low tone. His pace slowed. He came within a few yards, stopped, pawed again, then lowered his head slightly, as if puzzled by this strange creature who did not fight, did not flee. The air vibrated with tension so sharp, it seemed one breath might shatter it. Then, impossibly, Thunderbolt stepped closer. The massive chestnut beast, feared across the ranch, approached until the dust stirred by his breath mingled with the boy's. Ethan lifted one hand, palm up, not reaching, not demanding, simply offering. Minutes stretched. The men on the rails leaned so far forward it seemed the fence itself would break. Cole's knuckles whitened where he gripped the post. Mary Lou pressed both hands over her mouth, eyes wide with terror and awe. Thunderbolt lowered his head, his breath fanned warm across Ethan's palm. He did not bite, did not strike. He sniffed once, twice, then touched his muzzle to the boy's hand, the briefest graze of velvet against skin. The corral erupted with gasps. Ethan smiled faintly, not triumphant but calm, as though the moment had always been inevitable. "Thank you," he whispered to the horse. With that, Thunderbolt shook his mane, snorted, and backed away, not in fear, but in a strange, measured retreat. He trotted once around the corral, then stopped at the far side, turning to face Ethan again. The silence broke. "Holy hell," someone muttered. "That's not possible." Another crossed himself. Cole found his voice, sharp and strained. "It's a trick. Some kind of nonsense." But no one answered him. All eyes remained on Ethan, still seated in the dust, and the stallion who had not crushed him. Mr. Harrison's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. Calculation glittered in his gaze. He had wagered nothing on this, and yet the dice had landed in his favor. Perhaps the boy was not merely another stray mouth to feed. Perhaps he was something far more useful. Ethan rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, his gaze never leaving Thunderbolt. The boy's heart pounded with a rhythm he would never forget, the rhythm of silence, of trust born in a moment that defied every rule the ranch had known. The sun had dipped, low by the time the corral emptied, shadows stretching long across the yard. The dust raised by Thunderbolt's hooves still hung in the air, glowing orange in the fading light. Men shuffled back to their tasks in silence, their usual chatter swallowed by what they had just witnessed. For the first time in months, the ranch hands had nothing clever to say, no jeers ready on their tongues. What they'd seen unsettled them, a boy sitting in the dirt, while the devil horse bent its head as if in respect. Cole Dawson stormed away from the fence, jaw set hard. His boots struck the ground with heavy thuds, each step louder than the last. He hated silence almost as much as he hated being proven wrong. The boy's stillness in the corral had drawn every eye, and Cole felt the shift like a thorn under his skin. Men who once laughed with him now kept their mouths shut, sneaking glances not at him but at Ethan. That change, small as it seemed, was enough to turn Cole's disdain into something darker. Mr. Harrison lingered at the fence longer than anyone. He watched Ethan brush dirt from his hands, eyes still fixed on Thunderbolt. In Harrison's gaze there was no warmth, only the sharp glint of calculation. He had gambled nothing and gained a spectacle. A boy who could calm the most dangerous horse on his land was no stray anymore. He was a tool, an asset, perhaps even a profit waiting to be drawn. "Boy," Harrison called, his voice carrying across the yard. Ethan turned, startled, the fading sun catching in his dust-streaked hair. "You'll eat at the house tonight." Gasps flickered among the workers. No ranch hand, let alone a ragged drifter boy, ever sat at the table with the owner. Cole clenched his fists, rage tightening his throat, but said nothing. At supper, Ethan sat stiff and awkward in a chair far too fine for him. The dining room smelled of roasted beef and rich gravy, scents so strong they nearly made him dizzy after weeks of crusts and scraps. Harrison carved the meat with deliberate strokes, each slice measured as though portioned like figures in his ledger. Across the table, his pale eyes studied Ethan as one might study a curious specimen. "You didn't run," Harrison said, his tone flat but weighted. "Most men would have." "Why?" Ethan swallowed, his fork heavy in his hand. "Because he wasn't trying to kill me. He was trying to see if I'd hurt him first." His words hung in the air, simple yet sharp enough to still the clatter of silverware. Mary Lou, bustling in with bread, paused long enough to glance at Ethan with something like pride. But Harrison only leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "A horse like that is worth thousands," he said. "If you can make him useful, you'll stay. If not." He let the sentence hang unfinished. The silence after it was colder than any threat. That night, lying in the loft, Ethan turned the words over in his mind. If not. He stared up at the rafters, listening to the slow breath of horses below, the rustle of hay shifting with the wind. Thunderbolt's presence thrummed through the dark like a heartbeat. He wasn't just another horse. He was a creature that mirrored Ethan's own scars. And now, both their futures balanced on whether a boy's quiet defiance could transform into something more. The following days brought attention Ethan hadn't sought. Men who once dismissed him now watched with wary eyes. Some nodded stiffly as he passed, while others whispered, their voices laced with fear or envy. Cole, simmering with resentment, barked orders twice as harsh whenever Ethan crossed his path. Yet nothing stung more than the realization that Harrison's gaze was on him always, not with kindness but with ownership. Every move Ethan made, every glance at Thunderbolt, was weighed like coin on a scale. Ethan began spending hours near the corral, not daring to enter again but staying close enough for the stallion to know he was Pasolo. There, he would lean against the rail, speaking softly, his words drifting on the wind. Stories of his father's songs in the mine, of his mother's gentle way with sick colts, of nights spent alone under the stars. Thunderbolt would circle, ears flicking, nostrils flaring, sometimes stilling long enough to listen. Those moments filled Ethan with quiet hope, but the attention came at a cost. Cole's sneer grew sharper each day. Once, as Ethan hauled water, Cole accidentally tipped the bucket, drenching the boy in mud. Another time, he left a pitchfork where Ethan would nearly trip. Each act was small, but together they built a storm Ethan could feel gathering. Cole wasn't just angry, he was humiliated, and humiliated men were dangerous. One evening, Clara Harrison appeared at the edge of the barn, her dress catching the last of the sunlight. Ethan hadn't noticed her before, always careful to keep his head down around the owner's family. But now she stepped closer, her voice hesitant yet curious. "You didn't flinch," she said, almost a whisper. "When Thunderbolt came at you, you just sat there." Ethan shrugged, embarrassed. "If I'd moved, he would have thought I wanted a fight." Clara studied him for a long moment, her eyes wide with something Ethan couldn't place. Wonder, maybe, or recognition. She held out a folded cloth. "Here, I made this." It was a handkerchief, embroidered with small wildflowers, clumsy stitches but sincere. For when the dust gets too much. Ethan took it, stunned, his throat tight. For the first time since he'd arrived, he felt a kindness that wasn't mixed with mockery or calculation. But as the barn door creaked open and Cole's silhouette filled the frame, Clara stepped back quickly, vanishing into the twilight. Cole's eyes narrowed, his voice low and sharp. "Don't get comfortable, boy. Horses ain't the only ones who bite." The price of attention had been set. Ethan was no longer invisible. He was a target for envy, for ambition, and for the cold arithmetic of a man who saw him as nothing more than a means to tame the untamable. Morning arrived with a sky painted pale blue, streaked with thin clouds drifting over the distant mountains. The ranch buzzed with its usual rhythm, men shouting to one another as they herded cattle, the clang of hammers on metal, the steady thud of hooves echoing from the training pens. Yet Ethan felt the day unfold differently. Every glance, every half-whisper seemed to circle back to him. Since that moment in the corral, the boy was no longer just a shadow sweeping dust. He had become a figure the whole ranch measured with wary eyes. But it was Clara's eyes he remembered most. The daughter of Mr. Harrison, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that set her apart from the coarse laughter of the men. She was only 15, not much older than Ethan, yet she seemed older somehow, her gaze thoughtful, her words careful. The memory of her embroidered handkerchief weighed in Ethan's pocket, like a secret he wasn't sure he was allowed to keep. He spotted her later that morning, standing at the far fence beyond the orchard where wildflowers pushed up through the grass. She wasn't supposed to be there. Ranch hands had often muttered that the owner's daughter lived in a world apart, confined to porches and parlors. Yet there she was, hair catching the sunlight, her pale dress fluttering in the breeze. She leaned against the fence as if she had been waiting. Ethan hesitated. He knew stepping closer might spark more ridicule from Cole or the other men. Still, something in Clara's posture, half curious, half defiant, drew him forward. He walked slowly until only the fence separated them. "You weren't afraid," she said, skipping any greeting. Her voice was soft but steady. "When Thunderbolt circled you, you didn't move." Ethan glanced toward the corral where the chestnut stallion pawed the dirt, his mane whipping like fire in the wind. "If I'd moved, he would have thought I wanted to fight," Ethan replied. "I just wanted him to know I wasn't here to hurt him." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "My father says you're reckless. Cole says you're lucky. But I saw something else. He trusted you." The words struck Ethan harder than any insult had. Trust. It was the one thing he craved, the one thing he thought he'd lost. The night. His mother's breathing faded, and the world grew too big for him alone. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Clara reached into her apron and pulled out another piece of fabric, this one smaller, edges still rough from hurried stitching. "I tried again," she said with a shy smile, handing it over through the slats of the fence. This one bore a single stitched horse, uneven but recognizable, its mane flowing like the real thunderbolts. I thought maybe you'd keep it, like a charm. Ethan took it carefully, his throat tight. Why? He asked softly. She hesitated, then said, because I don't think you belong where they laugh at you, and because Thunderbolt doesn't laugh either. Before Ethan could reply, a sharp voice cut across the field. Cole. He strode toward them, his boots biting into the earth. His eyes narrowed, his tone sharp as barbed wire. Miss Clara, your father wouldn't like you talking with ranch hands, especially not strays. Clara straightened, her chin lifting. I wasn't asking for permission, Cole. Her defiance startled Ethan, but it also seemed to inflame Cole further. His jaw worked as though grinding stone. Watch yourself, boy, Cole hissed at Ethan once Clara had walked away toward the orchard path. You think taming a horse makes you special? You'll find men bite harder than beasts. The threat hung in the air, but Ethan said nothing. He folded the stitched cloth in his hand, slipping it into his pocket with the other. The weight of it steadied him. That evening, after chores were done, Ethan lingered at the corral fence. The sky burned with sunset, streaks of orange and red, mirroring the sheen of Thunderbolt's chestnut coat. Ethan leaned close to the rails and whispered, She sees it too. She knows you're more than what they say. Thunderbolt turned, ears flicking, and for a brief moment, Ethan swore the stallion stepped closer in acknowledgement. The fence no longer felt like a barrier that night. It felt like a bridge between Ethan and Thunderbolt, between Ethan and Clara, between the boy who had nothing and the fragile threads of trust beginning to weave around him. But bridges are fragile things, and on a ranch where envy brewed in silence, even the strongest bond could be tested. The next test came sooner than Ethan expected. The ranch was restless, the air thick with the kind of tension that made even the horses uneasy. Clouds gathered over the mountains, heavy and gray, and by midday a dry wind had swept across the valley, kicking up spirals of dust. Cole Dawson leaned against the fence with his arms folded, watching Ethan carry water buckets toward the corral. There was something in Cole's eyes, a glimmer of anticipation, the cruel satisfaction of a man waiting for another to fail. Mr. Harrison had ordered a demonstration, not for buyers yet, but for his own satisfaction. He wanted proof the boy's miracle in the dirt had not been a one-time trick. The men gathered again, murmuring among themselves, their voices sharper now, like gamblers eager to see if lightning could strike twice. Clara stood at the edge of the yard, her dress pressed by the wind, her hands clasped tightly together. She said nothing, but her gaze never left Ethan. The gate creaked open. Thunderbolt exploded into the ring like a storm unchained, his chestnut coat blazing in the dull light. He reared, hooves clawing at the air, then came down hard enough to rattle the rails. Dust flew up around him, turning the corral into a swirling haze. His eyes flashed, ears pinned, every muscle in his body tense with fury. Ethan stepped inside, barefoot again, each stride deliberate. He remembered the silence from before, the way calm had bridged the chasm between him and the stallion. But today the air felt different, charged, volatile, humming with more than just hooves. The crowd, the storm wind, and the subtle glint of metal in Cole's hand as he moved along the fence, all pressed down on him. At first, Thunderbolt circled, snorting, pawing at the ground. Ethan lowered himself once more to the dirt, his palms open, voice low and steady. It's me, he whispered. I'm not here to fight. The stallion's ears flicked, his pace slowing just slightly, the faintest hint of recognition. Hope flickered in Ethan's chest, then the crack of leather split the air. Cole had snapped a whip against the rail, a sound sharp as lightning. Thunderbolt jolted, his muscles surging, and in an instant the calm shattered. He lunged forward, mane flying, teeth bared. Gasps rose from the men at the fence, someone shouting, "Get him out!" But Ethan didn't run. He pressed himself lower, forcing his breath steady though terror clawed at him. Thunderbolt thundered past, so close the wind of his stride whipped Ethan's hair into his eyes. The stallion spun, hooves tearing up clods of dirt, circling back with a fury that made the corral quake. Ethan raised his voice now, not in fear but in desperate conviction. "I'm not them. I won't hurt you." For a heartbeat, Thunderbolt slowed. His head tossed, his eyes wild, but his ears twitched toward the boy. Ethan's chest hammered, dust coating his lips, but he refused to look away. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet he clung to the one truth that had carried him this far. Thunderbolt was not a demon, only a creature wounded deeper than most could imagine. The storm above broke with a low rumble, thunder rolling across the valley. Rain threatened, though none had yet fallen. The stallion halted, sides heaving, his gaze locked on Ethan. Dust and sweat streaked his coat, the scar beneath his mane stark in the dull light. Slowly, Ethan lifted his hand, palm open, just as before. This time the silence was not total, it was fragile, pierced by the restless shuffling of men and the low crackle of wind. But within it, Thunderbolt stepped forward. His breath came in hot bursts as he edged closer. Inch by inch, the fury bled away, leaving something rawer suspicion, yes, but also curiosity. He stopped within reach, muzzle quivering above Ethan's hand. Then another snap cut through the moment. Cole again, his whip striking the rail with a cruel grin on his face. Thunderbolt reared, the fragile calm splintering. Ethan dove sideways, the stallion crashing down where he had sat moments before. Shouts rang out, men scrambling. Clara's voice rose above them all. "Stop it! Leave them alone!" Mr. Harrison raised a hand, and the chaos froze. His eyes bore into Cole, cold and sharp. "Enough," he said, his voice like iron. Cole stiffened but obeyed, though his smirk lingered. The whip dangled at his side, dust clinging to its end. In the ring, Ethan stood slowly, chest heaving, his hands scraped and raw. Thunderbolt snorted, eyes rolling, but did not charge again. Instead, he backed toward the far rail, watching the boy with something almost like regret. Ethan met his gaze, the silent promise in his heart louder than any words. "I won't give up on you." The crowd dispersed in uneasy silence. Some muttered about luck running thin, others shook their heads, unwilling to believe what they had nearly seen again. Clara remained at the fence, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Cole stalked away, his shoulders rigid, his resentment boiling over. Harrison stayed last, his calculating gaze weighing boy and beast as though balancing numbers in his mind. As the first drops of rain fell, Ethan lingered in the ring, mud rising beneath his bare feet. Thunderbolt stood at the far side, sides heaving, mane plastered damp against his neck. For a brief instant, their eyes met once more. The storm outside might rage, but inside that gaze was something Ethan clung to, a sliver of understanding, a fragile bridge not yet broken. Night settled over Silver Creek Ranch with the soft hush of falling ash, smothering the last sounds of men and metal until only the creek and the wind remained. The storm that had rattled the rails all afternoon slunk back into the mountains, leaving the air washed and cool. Damp hay sweetened the barns, and the corrals, dark as ink, held the slow exhale of tired animals. Ethan waited until the lamps in the farmhouse blinked out one by one, then climbed down from the loft on bare feet, careful on the ladder so it wouldn't creak and give him away. He carried nothing but Clara's embroidered handkerchief, and a truth that felt suddenly too large for his chest. If fear can be taught, maybe trust can be too. Thunderbolt stood at the far end of the round pen, a deeper shade of night against the night, his chestnut coat wet with the day's rain and dried salt at the flanks. The scar tucked beneath his dark mane glinted pale whenever the moon slipped free of cloud. He did not pace now, he watched. The way a deer watches the line of the tree line, the way a boy watches a door he hopes will open and fears will slam. Ethan unlatched the gate and stepped inside. The dirt held the chill of evening, cool against his soles, pocked by hoofprints that pooled tiny, stubborn moons of water. He stayed near the fence until his breath slowed. The last thing he wanted was to carry the day's adrenaline back into this place like a spark into a hayloft. He sank onto the ground, cross-legged, palms open on his knees, and let silence find them. "I shouldn't have been here earlier," he whispered after a while, careful to let the words ride the wind rather than cut through it. Not with the whip, not with their voices. He tilted his head, as if listening to the answer only a boy alone would hear. "I'm sorry." Thunderbolt's ears flicked. He shifted his weight, a small scrape of iron-hard hoof over damp earth. Ethan didn't look directly at him. He had learned by now that looking straight on could feel like a demand. Instead, he watched the shape of the stallion at the edge of his vision, letting trust approach from the side. He told the horse a story, not to convince him, not to make a point, but to lay stones between them across the river of fear. He spoke about a narrow kitchen that had always smelled of cornmeal and warm milk, about a mother who sang low when the wind came up and the trailer shook, who could calm a colicky foal by stroking the ridge of its neck and humming old church notes into its mane. He described his father's voice in the mine, deep and steady, a lantern you could follow when the dark pressed too close. He spoke of the night both voices went quiet, and how afterward the world sounded wrong no matter where he stood in it. The words weren't tidy. They came out as they came. Images and heat, silence and hunger. The way a hand can still remember another hand even after it's been let go. Thunderbolt shifted again, but this time the movement drew him closer, a careful, unhurried slide of muscle. The pen was large enough that he could have kept his distance without effort. He didn't. He chose a line that bent toward the boy, stopped, breathed, came on again. Ethan kept talking, because it felt like the only bridge he knew how to build. "My father had a song for the end of a shift," Ethan said softly. "Sang it in the washroom, said it scrubbed the rock dust out of your lungs, as quick as soap did your hands. It wasn't pretty." He smiled at the memory, small and helpless, but it was steady. He didn't try for melody first. He just found the way his father had set words into a beat, like a boot on the ground, left, right, left, nothing fancy, only dependable. He tapped the rhythm against his knee with 2 fingers and let the note slip out of his mouth. His voice wasn't much thin from weeks of traveling, rusted at the edges, but it was true. Notes low enough not to startle, carrying more breath than sound, the way a man would sing into a sleeping child's hair, so the song touched skin before it touched ear. Thunderbolt lifted his head, then lowered it, nostrils opening to taste the air that carried the boy's breath. He blinked slow, the hard line around his eyes softening, his weight settling evenly as if he'd finally remembered the ground could hold him. When Ethan's voice wavered, the horse snorted a small, questioning sound, and Ethan steadied. He let the song loop until it stopped sounding like a memory and started sounding like a thing the 2 of them were making together, here and now, under a sky rinsed clean. "Good," Ethan whispered when the last note fell apart. "Good boy." He knew the words were old habit, human habit, and that horses learned their meaning less from syllables than from the weather of the body that delivered them. He gave the word to his hands and shoulders, to the slow flex of his lungs, to the quiet spine that refused to rise like a challenge. Hoof by hoof, Thunderbolt closed the final feet between them, the space that had always rushed full of panic in daylight. He didn't rush. He drifted, the way a creek widens around a stone. The smell of him reached Ethan first, wet hide and dust, lightning and iron, something green the stallion had torn from the far pasture and kept between his teeth. The horse stretched his neck, and Ethan, eyes down, hand turned open, lifted his palm, not high, not toward, just up enough that if the stallion wanted it, it would be there. A breath, another. Then the velvet cool of muzzle found skin. Not a tap and retreat like the other day. A press. Wait. Ethan felt the small muscles at the edges of his palm respond, the way the horse tasted him salt. "Hey." Boy then stayed. The boy's throat closed around something too tender for language. He didn't cry. The night would have accepted tears, but his body had learned early that to sob is to shake, and to shake is to spook a frightened thing. He made a different choice. He breathed, slow and regular, the way his father had once taught him when a roof buckle let the wind in at winter and made the house groan. Thunderbolt exhaled. It wasn't loud, not the startle of a snort. It was the sound big animals make when they find the place their bones can rest low and long and almost warm to the touch. The horse's lower lip loosened. He chewed once, as if deciding whether to argue with the newness of this night, then chose not to. His head slid, heavy as history, until it hovered over Ethan's shoulder. The weight never quite fell. The stallion gave the choice back to gravity and to the boy. Ethan leaned into it, barely. He didn't need a photograph. He needed the 2 of them to feel where each ended and the other began. "You did nothing wrong today," Ethan murmured, voice going thinner as tiredness tugged at it. It was the noise, the crack. "I know that sound too." His right hand rose and found the place beneath the dark mane where the skin ran uneven. He didn't stroke. He rested his fingers as if reading Braille. The horse's skin quivered and settled. A coyote called from the far ridge, lonely and proud at once. The creek answered, busy with its own small music. Somewhere behind them, a screen door sighed and closed. The ranch slept and then slept deeper. The boy and the horse did not move for a long time. In that holding, something shifted, less a miracle than a terrible, necessary labor finally completed. The day had braided fear between them. Night unbraided it, strand by patient strand. When Thunderbolt finally eased his head away, Ethan let the space return without snatching at it. He unfolded his legs slowly, bones complaining, and rose to a crouch. The stallion watched, ears forward, interest unspooked by the change in height. Ethan stood, and the horse stood with him, their shadows briefly grafted together by a blade of moonlight. "Tomorrow," Ethan said, feeling the word in his mouth before daring to give it air. He glanced at the fence where, weeks ago, he had first watched Thunderbolt and felt the old ache reorder itself into something that wasn't only loss. "Tomorrow we try something new. No rope, no shouting," he swallowed. "Only trust." Thunderbolt flicked an ear, then stepped close enough that the boy felt the brush of a whisker against his wrist. Quick, almost playful, a question asked in a language that used no words. Ethan's laugh came out as a puff of white in the cooling air. He slid his palm along the arc of the stallion's neck, mapping the curve so his skin would remember it in case the day offered no time for remembering. He left the pen when the moon had climbed and the barn shadows shortened. At the gate he paused and looked back. The chestnut stood where he'd been, head lifted, watching the boy go, not with hunger or rage but with the clean curiosity of an animal who has at last been offered a choice that doesn't hurt. "Sleep, big guy," Ethan whispered, because it helped him to say it. "I'll be here in the morning." The latch clicked softly behind him. The yard lay in a hush so complete that even his bare feet on the boards of the barn aisle sounded loud. He climbed the ladder to the loft and slid into the hay, the sweet dust of it rising around him like a blanket. His body trembled then, the stored fear finding a crack to escape. But when it was done, it was done. He tucked Clara's handkerchief beneath his cheek and let his father's steady song walk him toward sleep. Down in the darkness, a stallion shifted, the sand whispering under his. Wait. When dawn pushed a pale hand over the rim of the world, boy and horse would meet the ring again. The men would lean in, the gate would open, and the next thing would happen, the unthinkable, maybe, or just the next right step after a long night of whispered words. The ranch woke to a sky painted in pale silver, the ground still damp from the night storm. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and new. Ethan stirred in the loft before the rooster crowed, his mind restless after the long night beside Thunderbolt. Clara's embroidered handkerchief still lay folded under his head, its small weight a reminder that someone else believed in what he was trying to do. He rose, brushed hay from his clothes, and slipped down the ladder. His hands trembled with anticipation, though his face wore the quiet calm he had learned to carry like armor. At the corral, Thunderbolt was already awake, his chestnut coat gleaming damp beneath the first rays of dawn. He snorted at the boy's approach, tossing his mane as if challenging the world to try him again. But his eyes, dark and watchful, softened the moment Ethan rested his palms against the rail. Ethan whispered low, a promise carried on the chill morning air. "No tricks, no whips, just us." By mid-morning the men gathered again. They came not because they were ordered, but because something in them could not stay away. The story of the boy and the horse had spread across the ranch like fire through dry grass. Bets were whispered, smirks traded, but beneath the bravado lay unease. They had seen something once, nearly seen it again, and now they hungered for proof. Cole stood apart, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tightly a vein pulsed in his temple. Clara lingered behind the men, her gaze steady, her hands knotted together in silence. Mr. Harrison arrived last. He took his place by the rail, his coat immaculate, his pale eyes sharp. He spoke only 3 words: "Open the gate." The latch groaned, and Ethan stepped into the ring. The hush was immediate, so complete that the cry of a hawk overhead seemed deafening. Thunderbolt pawed the earth, muscles coiled like springs, dust curling around his hooves. Ethan walked slowly to the center, the way one approaches a chapel aware of its power, reverent of what it could do to you if you misstepped. For a moment, the stallion charged the perimeter, circling in restless arcs, his mane flying like a banner in battle. The men muttered, shifting on their boots, convinced the boy would be thrown into the dirt. But Ethan did not crouch this time. He remained standing, tall in his smallness, breathing deep. "It's just us," he whispered again, his voice more prayer than command. Thunderbolt slowed, his circle tightened. Dust rose in golden spirals as he drew closer, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Ethan extended one hand. The stallion halted, head lowering, and pressed his muzzle into the boy's palm with a gentleness that made the crowd exhale in disbelief. The sound was not cheers, not yet just the stunned intake of breath when a world rearranges itself before your eyes. Ethan stroked the ridge of Thunderbolt's neck, each touch as careful as a man setting down glass. Then, moving slow as dawn itself, he placed both hands in the thick mane. His heart hammered, his breath trembled, but his body remembered the weight of the night before, the song, the scar, the way the horse had finally let go. He pulled himself upward. The men shouted. Clara gasped. Cole swore under his breath. But Harrison's eyes narrowed, calculating, not surprised. Ethan swung a leg over, settling onto the broad back without saddle, without rope. Thunderbolt stiffened, head jerking, body taut as a drawn bow. For a heartbeat the world teetered between triumph and disaster. Then the stallion exhaled, long and low, and began to walk. It was not a parade. It was not polished. It was raw, breathtaking simplicity. A boy riding bareback on the horse no man had mastered. Step by step, Thunderbolt carried him around the ring. Dust clung to their ankles. The sunlight flared against chestnut hide and pale skin, and silence held the crowd in its fist. Ethan did not kick, did not pull, did not command. He only sat, balanced, hands resting lightly against the mane as though he had always belonged there. When Thunderbolt lifted into a trot, the ring seemed to lift with him. The boy's body swayed in rhythm, his face alive with something brighter than pride. He smiled an unguarded smile that lit him from the inside. A boy transformed into a figure out of story. In that moment, he was no longer the stray orphan. He was the rider who had turned storm into song. The men could not stay silent any longer. A murmur swelled into astonished exclamations. Impossible! By God! Look at him! Even hardened hands, men who had seen horses all their lives, crossed themselves or shook their heads like they were seeing a ghost. Clara's eyes shone, tears slipping down her cheeks unnoticed. Only Cole's face twisted darker. Fury mingled with something else, fear. He saw not just a boy taming a horse, but a boy threatening the order of things. And Harrison, silent still, leaned forward on the rail, his pale eyes shining with the cold gleam of a man already converting miracle into currency. After 3 full turns around the corral, Ethan slid down Thunderbolt's side, landing lightly on the ground. The stallion lowered his head until his forehead pressed against the boy's chest. The crowd hushed again, as if the gesture demanded reverence. For a breathless moment, it looked like a coronation, the untamable horse bowing before the boy who had listened instead of forced. Ethan's voice was barely audible, but those closest heard it. "Thank you, friend." Thunderbolt flicked an ear, then lifted his head high, mane whipping, and let out a cry that shook the valley. The sound carried beyond the ranch, across the fields, up into the mountains themselves. Men stared, spellbound. The world had witnessed the unthinkable, and nothing would ever be the same. The echoes of Thunderbolt's cry still clung to the air long after the corral had emptied. Men drifted back to their duties, though every face wore the stunned pallor of men who had witnessed something they'd never forget. Some muttered prayers, others argued in low voices about what it meant, but all of them carried the weight of the miracle. Ethan, still dust-streaked and trembling, sat alone by the trough, splashing water on his face. His smile came and went, like a ghost, real, fleeting, impossible to hold. He had done it. For a heartbeat, the storm had carried him. Clara found him first. She approached quietly, her steps light, her eyes alight with a mix of pride and fear. "They'll never laugh at you again," she whispered. Ethan looked up, half shy, half exhausted, and managed a crooked smile. "I don't care if they laugh," he said. "I just care that he let me ride." Clara nodded, though worry lingered at the edge of her expression. She knew her father, and she knew smiles in that house were never gifts, they were bargains. Indeed, on the porch of the main house, Mr. Harrison stood with Cole at his side. Harrison's mouth curved in a smile so thin it might have been carved in glass. To anyone else, it looked like approval. To Clara, it was a knife polished clean. "You saw it," Harrison said, his voice low. "The boy can do what none of you could. That horse is money waiting to be minted." Cole's jaw flexed. "He's dangerous, sir. A stray with tricks. The men will talk. They'll say he's something more than he island." His words came sharp, bitter, but beneath them was fear, the fear of losing his place. Harrison turned his gaze on him, pale eyes like a winter river. "Then let them talk. Talk fills the air. Money fills the hand. Buyers will come from Texas, from beyond. They'll pay. To see a boy ride the devil horse. They'll pay more to own what I've proven possible." His smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "This ranch bleeds every day that horse eats without earning. Now he will pay me back with interest." That evening, Ethan was summoned to the house again. He sat stiff in a high-backed chair while Harrison poured himself a glass of whiskey. The golden liquid caught the lamplight, burning as bright as the man's ambition. "You've done something extraordinary," Harrison said, tone measured, as though the words cost him nothing. "Thunderbolt answers to you. That makes you valuable." Ethan frowned, unsure. "I don't want to be valuable. I just want him safe." The glass clinked as Harrison set it down. His smile sharpened. "Safe, boy. Nothing in this world is safe unless it earns its keep. Not men, not horses. You think the world feeds mouths for free?" Ethan clenched his fists in his lap but said nothing. He could feel the knife edge beneath those words. He wasn't being praised, he was being weighed, priced, claimed. Mary Lou slipped into the room with a tray of bread, her eyes flicking quickly between Harrison's pale face and Ethan's hunched shoulders. She lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, setting her hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder before retreating. The gesture was small, but it steadied him, like a lantern in a tunnel. "Tomorrow," Harrison said, rising to his feet, "we begin proper training. You will ride for the men. You will ride until the horse bends to showmanship. And when the buyers arrive, you will show them what I own." Ethan's breath caught. "He's not something to own. He's not—" Harrison's hand slammed on the table, rattling the glass. "Everything here is mine," he snapped. "The land, the cattle, the men, the horses, even you, boy. You eat my food, you sleep under my roof. Do not forget who holds the reins." The silence afterward was heavy, broken only by the creak of the house in the evening wind. Ethan lowered his gaze, swallowing words that would only burn him. When he left the house, the air outside felt colder than the storm had. Clara was waiting by the steps, her face pale. "I heard him," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "He doesn't care about Thunderbolt. Not really." Clara's eyes darkened. "He never cares about what something feels, only what it earns." She touched Ethan's sleeve, her voice urgent. "You have to be careful. He'll smile at you while he cuts away everything that makes you different." Ethan looked toward the corral where Thunderbolt stood, silhouetted against the rising moon. The stallion's head lifted, ears pricked, as if he too sensed the knife hidden in Harrison's grin. Ethan whispered, mostly to himself, "I won't let him." Cole's shadow moved at the edge of the yard, silent and watching. His smirk was gone, replaced by something meaner, a coil of envy wound tight. Between the owner's ambition and the foreman's rage, Ethan realized he was no longer invisible. He was a prize to one man, a threat to another. The night pressed close, heavy with the weight of new dangers. Ethan gripped Clara's handkerchief in his pocket, its stitches rough but true. Harrison's smile haunted him still, gleaming like a blade in the lamplight. Morning came bright and hard, the kind of Montana light that leaves no room for secrets. Mr. Harrison wanted proper training, which meant tack and spectacle, a saddle cinched tight and reins that could be shown to buyers like proof stamped in leather. Ethan had slept little. The memory of the bareback ride shimmered in his mind like heat above a road, beautiful and dangerous to stare at too long. He washed at the pump, the water biting cold, and told himself to keep steady. Thunderbolt would feel whatever lived in his chest. He had to make sure it was calm. In the tack room, the smell of oiled leather and old sweat pressed close. Saddles hung like dark moons, bridles draped neat as a surgeon's tools. Cole was already there, coiling a lariat with lazy precision, the scar on his jaw stark in the morning light. "You want a saddle that'll hold," he said, voice even. "Buyers don't pay to see a boy cling to hair." His smile did not reach his eyes. Ethan kept his tone civil. "I'll use the light roper. He hates weight." Cole's laugh was a soft scrape. "You don't get to decide what a horse hates." He plucked a saddle from the rack heavier than Ethan would have chosen, and a thick wool pad from the shelf. As he turned, Clara appeared in the doorway, a ribbon of sun haloing her hair. She should have been in the house, but she stepped over the threshold like it was a line she'd decided no longer applied to her. "Use the training pad," she said, voice steady though her hands worried the edge of her apron. "The gray one. It's thinner." Cole didn't look at her. "We're not playing children's games, Miss Clara." He flipped the pad, brushing it with his palm. Ethan caught a prickle against his skin when he took it, something rough, hidden deep in the wool. He frowned, ran his fingers along the underside. Nothing obvious, maybe a burr, maybe only nerves. He lifted the saddle and followed Cole to the ring. Clara's gaze caught his. She shook her head once, a tiny movement, warning laced into it. In the corral, men already lined the rails, curious as crows. Harrison stood apart, immaculate as always, hands clasped behind his back. Thunderbolt watched from the far end, chestnut coat alive with light. He took a step when Ethan approached, ears pricked, breath lifting dust in soft puffs. The stallion's calm steadied the boy's hands. "Easy," Ethan murmured, laying the pad along the broad back. Thunderbolt flinched, a ripple of muscle, then stilled. Ethan frowned again. He lifted the pad, checked the underside, found only wool and shadow. He placed it back carefully and raised the saddle. As he settled the leather, Cole appeared at his shoulder like a second shadow. "Let me cinch," Cole said, almost friendly. "You've got small hands." Ethan opened his mouth to refuse, then saw Harrison watching. Pride would look like defiance. He stepped back a half pace. Cole knelt and ran the latigo through the rigging, fast and smooth, the tugging rhythm too quick to follow. He stood, gave the skirt a pat, and flashed a white slice of teeth. There, safe as a church. Ethan laid a hand on Thunderbolt's neck and felt heat under hide, the thrum of a heart that wasn't his. The stallion's skin twitched along the shoulder where the pad lay. Something in the boy's gut went cold. He glanced at Clara. She had moved closer to the gate, eyes narrow, reading the scene like a page she knew would end badly. "Walk," Ethan said softly. He led Thunderbolt forward, letting the weight find its place. The stallion moved with a high, choppy step he did not use bareback, head tilted as if trying to shake something from his withers. Ethan stopped, slid his fingers under the front skirt, felt along the fleece. A sting met his fingertip, quick and mean. He pinched, pulled, and a small, dried cocklebur came free, wicked little hooks bristling in the light. He looked at Cole, who only widened his eyes, innocent as a hymn. "Horses pick those up all the time," Cole said. "You planning to blame the field for every misstep?" Ethan kept his voice even. It was buried deep. Cole's shrug was art. "You're welcome." Mary Lou had drifted to the corner of the fence, wiping her hands on a towel that smelled of flour. She didn't speak, but her face said what she could not in front of Harrison. "Watch him." Clara's mouth was a thin line. Ethan slipped the burr into his pocket and checked the cinch himself. It felt snug enough, but something about the knot, too tidy, too pretty, bothered him. He tugged once more. It held. He breathed, turned to Thunderbolt, and pressed his brow briefly to the stallion's cheek. "It's us," he whispered. "No one else." He swung up. The leather took his weight, creaked like an old door in a familiar house. Thunderbolt stiffened, then held. Ethan kept his heels off, hands low, breath a steady metronome. "Walk," he said again. The stallion stepped, 1 to 2, 1 to 2, a wary march. Then, with no warning, the saddle slid a fraction to the left. Ethan compensated, weight to the right, another step, another slip. He reached down, fingers brushing the latigo. Loose, not enough to fall, enough to drift, just enough to boil fear under hide. Thunderbolt humped his back, tail lashing. The ring jumped into chaos, boots thudding, men shouting, a slap of palm against rail. Cole's laugh cut through like a whip crack. The saddle dropped another inch, then another, and the world tilted. Ethan didn't grab leather, grabbing would drag the rigging with him. He flattened his hands into the mane and slid, not off but forward, pressing his chest along the neck, making his body one long line to counter the pull. "Easy," he said, breath steady even as the ground tilted and snapped. "It's not your fault, big guy. It's not your fault." Thunderbolt crow-hopped, a violent bound that could tear a man loose in an instant. The crowd gasped. Clara's voice split the air. "Stop it!" The cinch. Harrison's hand lifted, useless against physics. The latigo unwound like a snake spitting out a secret. Ethan felt the universe make a choice. Throw or hold. He made his own. He kicked free of the stirrups and let himself roll with the saddle as it slipped underbelly, his fingers ripping away to keep from jerking the stallion down. Thunderbolt blew, a blast of sound and heat, and rocketed forward. Saddle and pad tumbled like laundry, leather slapping mud. Ethan hit his shoulder, his back, his breath slamming out of him in a sound. That wasn't a sound at all. Silence then, the ring erupted. Some men ran for the gate, others just shouted at the world. Cole stood very still, mouth curved, eyes alight with the kind of joy that has no business near a human face. Harrison's lips thinned to nothing. Ethan rolled to his knees, stars popping behind his eyes. He lifted his head. Thunderbolt had wheeled and come back not at him, but near, skidding to a stop in a spray of dirt so close the boy felt grit pepper his cheeks. The stallion stood over the fallen saddle, ears forward. eyes burning not with madness but alarm. He pawed once, a question hammered into earth. "It's okay," Ethan rasped, voice broken glass and breath. He lifted both hands, palms open, showing emptiness. "Not your fault. Not yours." The horse's chest heaved. He took one step, one more, then lowered his head until the warm bar of his muzzle touched Ethan's forehead. Around them, the world reassembled, men's voices returning to their bodies, boots pounding the boards. Mary Lou climbed through the rails with surprising speed, dropping to Ethan's side. "Kid," she breathed, hands already at his collarbone, his shoulder, a check as practical as prayer. "You with me?" "I'm here," he managed. Pain spread down his side like spilled ink, but it was bearable. He reached for the fallen tack. Clara was faster. She snatched up the latigo, held it high. The knot Cole had tied had not slipped. It had been half-tied in a way that would look firm until the horse warmed and sweat slicked the leather. Clara's face flushed with fury. "You did this," she said to Cole, voice low enough to shake. "You meant to throw him." Cole lifted his hands as if they might be searched for guilt. "Careful with your accusations, miss. Knots slip. Boys fall. Horses buck. That's ranch life." Harrison took the strap from Clara, eyes cold. He turned it, studied the threading, looked up at Cole with a gaze that could skin a man. "Knots tell stories," he said softly, so only those closest heard. "And this one sings." For a breath, Ethan thought, justice might descend like sudden rain. But Harrison's gaze flicked to the ring of men, the open sky, the future he counted in stamped figures and contracts. He tucked the strap into his coat pocket like a note he meant to read later and said, louder, "Enough." The boy lost his seat. "Tomorrow we try again." The air left Clara as if someone had struck her. Mary Lou rose slow as a tide, pulled Ethan gently to his feet. "You'll be black and blue," she murmured, helping him to the rail. "But I've seen worse on men twice your size with half your sense." Thunderbolt followed, close as a shadow. He pressed his cheek to Ethan's shoulder and stood there, head low, as if apologizing for a crime he hadn't committed. Ethan set his palm to the warm plane of the horse's face and felt his own breath come back in something like rhythm. Across the ring, Cole leaned on the fence, the picture of patience, the smile gone from his mouth but not from his eyes. He touched two fingers to his hat brim at Clara in a mock salute that made her hands curl to fists. That afternoon, the ranch worked in a hush that felt like the minutes after a sermon, when no one wants to speak first. Word spread fast. The boy had fallen. Half the men told the tale with a shake of the head that blamed foolishness. The other half let their voices drift into the space between, where suspicion lives. Knots tell stories. The story had begun to write itself. In the barn, Mary Lou wrapped Ethan's ribs and scolded him for refusing laudanum. Clara stood at the stall door, stroking Thunderbolt's nose. Her anger settled into a bright, steady thing. "You can't ride with their gear," she said, not looking at Ethan but at the horse who trusted him without paper or ink. "Not if he's allowed near it." Ethan stared up at the rafters, at the dust motes, spinning like a slow constellation. "I won't," he said, bareback or not at all. He glanced at the pad on the floor, at the burr in his pocket, at the memory of leather easing loose like a lie. "He's not a trick." Clara finally looked at him. "Then don't let them turn him into one." Outside, the sky went the color of hammered copper. Workers moved like figures in a snow globe that had been shaken too hard and finally set down. Harrison crossed the yard alone, coat flaring, eyes on a line only he could see. He would not forget the knot, Ethan knew that. He would not forgive it, either not out of mercy, but because sabotage threatened the coin he meant to mint. Still, justice wasn't the master of this place. Profit was. Ethan slid down from the cot with a wince and pressed his forehead to Thunderbolt's blaze. "We learned something," he whispered. "About them. About what they'll do." The stallion breathed against his hair, gentle as a hand. "Next time," Ethan said, and felt the words settle into the bones of his jaw. "We don't give them ropes to cut." The day bled out in slow colors, copper fading to rose, giving way to a deep blue that swallowed the valley whole. By the time the last chores ended, the ranch was quiet, save for the restless shifting of horses and the creak of the barn beams cooling from the heat of the Sunday. Ethan slipped outside, ribs bound beneath his shirt, each breath sharp but bearable. The bruises from the fall ached like iron pressed into his skin, yet he found himself drawn to the corral again, as if Thunderbolt's presence could ease the weight. The chestnut stallion stood near the rails, mane tousled by the night wind. His coat caught the rising moonlight, glowing a deep, burnished red. He watched Ethan with eyes that reflected the stars, ears flicking in recognition. When Ethan stepped closer, the horse gave a low rumble from his chest, a sound not of warning but of acknowledgement, the way one friend greets another in the dark. Ethan eased himself down in the grass just outside the corral. He tilted his head back, staring at the sky that seemed impossibly wide here, filled with more stars than any town window had ever shown him. His ribs ached too much to lie flat, so he sat hunched, hands curled around his knees. He began to speak, voice low enough that only the horse and perhaps the heavens could hear. "I used to think the sky ended where the roof of our trailer stopped," he said softly. "I thought maybe the stars weren't real, just painted holes in the dark." He smiled faintly, his breath catching with memory. "Mama said they were real, and each one carried a story. She'd point at them and tell me, 'That one's for the miners, digging where no sunlight reaches. That one's for the mothers who keep the lamps burning until the last man comes home.'" Thunderbolt shifted closer, brushing the fence with his shoulder. Ethan listened to the scrape of wood against hide, the rhythm of hooves planting steady in the dirt. It calmed him more than any medicine Mary Lou had offered earlier. "I don't know which one's mine," Ethan continued. "Maybe I don't have one yet. Maybe I've been waiting for someone else's star to burn out so I can take its place." He pulled Clara's embroidered cloth from his pocket, smoothing the rough stitches between his fingers. "But when I rode you, it felt like we found one together, like the whole sky noticed." The horse snorted, stamping once, as if to agree or perhaps only to demand another story. Ethan laughed, though it was thin, cracked by the pain in his ribs. He told Thunderbolt about the mine songs again, about the way his father's voice would echo until it sounded like an army underground. He hummed a line, the sound barely above breath, and the horse's ears swiveled toward him. "You like that one," Ethan whispered. "I can tell." A sudden rustle made him glance toward the orchard. Clara emerged from the shadows, holding a lantern. Its flame painted her face in gold and shadow, her eyes brighter than the light itself. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, though her voice carried no reproach. "You're hurt," Ethan shrugged. "I've been hurt before. This hurts less when I talk to him." Clara moved closer, setting the lantern on a fence post. She stood beside him, folding her hands in front of her. For a long moment, they both watched Thunderbolt, who stood calmly now, head lowered, tail swishing lazily in the night breeze. "He trusts you," Clara said finally. "More than he trusts anyone, more than he trusts himself." Ethan nodded. "And that's why I have to keep him safe. Your father doesn't see him." "Not really. To him, Thunderbolt's just a number waiting to be cashed in." Clara's jaw tightened. "I know. He's planning to invite buyers next week. He said so at dinner." Her gaze flicked to Ethan, sharp with urgency. "You need to be ready. They'll push you to perform. And if anything goes wrong," Ethan didn't need her to finish. He looked up at the stars again, letting their endlessness remind him that some truths stretch beyond ranch fences and ledger books. "Then we make sure nothing goes wrong," he said quietly. Clara reached into her pocket and drew out another cloth scrap, smaller than the others. This one bore a stitched star, simple, uneven, but bright against the fabric. She pressed it into his hand. "This one's yours," she said, "so you don't forget you belong under the sky too." Ethan's throat tightened. He tucked it carefully beside the handkerchief in his pocket, both pressed close to his heart. They sat together in silence, the lantern's glow dimming as the night deepened. Thunderbolt grazed quietly, his breaths a steady metronome against the symphony of crickets and the distant call of a night bird. The world felt, for once, at peace. Yet beyond the corral, shadows moved, men passing, voices hushed. Cole's laugh drifted faintly, sharp as broken glass. Ethan stiffened, but Clara touched his arm lightly. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Tonight is ours. Let them have tomorrow." Ethan leaned his head back once more, eyes fixed on the stitched star Clara had given him and its twin burning above in the vast Montana sky. He breathed deep, steady, and let the night wrap him in a promise. No matter what traps waited, he and Thunderbolt had this, the quiet bond beneath the stars, too true for any man's ledger to measure. Sunday morning brought a brittle calm to Silver Creek Ranch. The air was clear, the sun sharp, and the smell of sage carried over the fields. Yet underneath the beauty lay a nervous current, like the silence before a gunshot. Ethan rose early, his ribs still sore, but his mind sharper than his pain. He had spent the night clutching Clara's stitched star, reminding himself that trust could be a shield. Still, his stomach twisted when Mr. Harrison ordered him into the house. Buyers had come. The parlor was filled with men from Texas, broad hats, polished boots, and eyes that measured everything the way Harrison's did, not for spirit, but for price. They spoke in voices that carried across the wooden floorboards, discussing horsepower and speed as if a living creature were no more than a bolt of fabric. Thunderbolt's name fell from their lips with the same inflection they used for cattle. Ethan stood in the doorway, hands tight at his sides, wishing the walls themselves would spit them back out. Harrison's smile was thin, practiced. "Gentlemen, you've heard the talk. Today you'll see it with your own eyes. The boy and the horse, the impossible, made routine." His gaze flicked to Ethan. "Do not fail me." The words bit deep. Ethan didn't care about failing Harrison, but he thought of Thunderbolt, how the stallion would be forced to perform for men who saw him as nothing but coin. A promise echoed in Ethan's head. No ropes, no shouting, only trust. He clenched it like a lifeline. Outside, the corral gleamed under the noon Sunday. Men gathered along the rails, murmurs sharp with anticipation. Clara stood near the back, pale but resolute, Mary Lou beside her like a steady oak. Cole leaned close to the Texans, speaking low, his grin sly. Ethan caught fragments, not tamed but broken, took the devil out of him. Lies smooth enough to sell. When Ethan led Thunderbolt into the ring, the stallion snorted and shook his mane, chestnut coat blazing. He moved with restless grace, ears flicking at the crowd. Ethan pressed a hand to his neck. "It's us," he whispered. "Only us." The first minutes were steady. Ethan mounted bareback, guiding Thunderbolt in a wide circle. The stallion's stride lengthened, dust rising behind them, and for a breath the crowd gasped, the way they had before. Clara's eyes shone. Mary Lou pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Harrison's smile widened. Then, from the shadows near the fence, came the sharp crack of leather, familiar, hateful. Cole's whip. It snapped against the rail, not striking Thunderbolt but close enough to slice the air. The stallion jolted, eyes wide, muscles coiling in panic. Ethan's chest clenched. He leaned low, voice urgent but soft. "Not your fault. Easy, boy, easy." But the men at the rails erupted in shouts. The Texans bellowed for more speed, more spectacle. "Make him run," one demanded. "Let's see his fire." Their hunger for chaos poured into the ring like oil on flame. Harrison's voice cut through, cold as steel. "Show them, boy, ride him hard." Ethan's heart pounded. This was the promise breaking the line between trust and performance, snapping under the weight of greed. Thunderbolt surged forward, hooves tearing the earth, his body a storm unwilling to be caged. Ethan clung, not with fear but with desperation, guiding with breath, not force. He shouted above the din, not to the men but to the horse. "They don't see you, but I do." The stallion bucked once, twice, throwing dirt high, and the crowd gasped. A Texan laughed. "Worth a fortune." Harrison's eyes gleamed like coin under lamplight, but Clara's voice rang clear and furious. "Stop! Can't you see he's afraid?" No one listened. The noise roared on. Thunderbolt reared, front legs slicing the air. Ethan nearly slid, ribs screaming, but he wrapped his arms into the mane and pressed his face against the hot curve of the stallion's neck. "I'm here," he whispered. "I promised you." And in that moment, something broke, not in Thunderbolt, not in Ethan, but in the space between them and the watching world. The horse came down, trembling, sweat darkening his coat. He stood rigid, panting, while Ethan slid off and planted himself between the stallion and the crowd. His voice cracked but carried. "He's not your prize. He's not your beast to buy. He's my friend." The corral froze. Laughter faltered. Even Harrison's lips pressed tight. Cole's eyes burned, dark with rage. Clara stepped forward, defiance blazing in her face. But the Texans muttered, unimpressed. "Too soft," one said. "What good's a horse that won't be pushed?" Harrison's smile returned, sharper than ever. "You'll see more next time," he told them, voice smooth, already arranging another show. His hand clamped on Ethan's shoulder as the men drifted away. "You will do as you're told," he hissed. Ethan met Thunderbolt's gaze, the stallion trembling still but standing tall beside him. The boy's heart felt heavy, but his resolve had never been clearer. Promises had been broken around him all his life, but not this one, not between him and the horse. The ranch did not sleep that night. Whispers drifted from bunkhouse to barn, moving like wildfire on dry grass. Men argued in low voices, some praising Ethan's courage, others condemning him for defying Harrison in front of the Texans. But what lingered most was the image, the boy standing before the stallion, shouting that he was not a prize. It was a picture too sharp to ignore, and it unsettled every man who had ever thought of horses as coin. In the loft, Ethan sat awake, ribs aching, his mind running circles around the day. He had felt the moment when Thunderbolt nearly bolted, when the crowd's hunger nearly swallowed them both whole. He had felt Harrison's hand clamp on his shoulder like iron. Yet what clung deepest was the way Thunderbolt trembled afterward, not in rage, but in the memory of something older, deeper. That trembling told Ethan the truth he had always suspected. The scars under the stallion's mane weren't just accidents of the wild. They were wounds carved by men. By dawn, the truth was ready to surface. It began when Mary Lou cornered one of the older ranch hands in the cookhouse. "I know what I saw," she said, her voice low but firm. "That scar didn't come from barbed wire. Someone put it there." The man shifted, avoiding her eyes. "Best not to speak of it," he muttered. "The boss bought him cheap because no one else wanted the trouble. Folks said he'd been whipped near to death before they brought him in." The word spread. By the time the sun climbed high, the story had reached the corral. Men gathered, restless, their gazes flicking between Harrison and the boy who now carried the horse's trust. Ethan heard fragments whipped, burned, broken before he was ever ours. His stomach turned. He had known it in Thunderbolt's eyes, but hearing it aloud made his chest burn with fury. Harrison tried to drown the fire with coin. He barked orders, drove men back to work, promised them bonuses if they kept their mouths shut, but suspicion had already taken root. Even those who relied on his pay could not unsee the trembling stallion, the scar that spoke louder than any lie. That afternoon, Harrison demanded another show, hoping to bury whispers under spectacle. The men gathered again, Clara and Mary Lou pressed against the rails, Cole lurking with his whip hidden at his side. Ethan led Thunderbolt in, but this time he didn't mount. Instead, he stopped in the center, running his hand along the thick mane until it parted to reveal the jagged scar. "Look," Ethan called, his voice cracking through the air. "This is why he fights. This is why he fears. Someone taught him pain long before he ever came here." He turned, his eyes locking on Harrison. "And you want to teach him more, just to make him shine for buyers." The ranch fell silent. The men shifted uneasily, their boots grinding dirt. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and Mary Lou's lips pressed tight in grim agreement. Cole sneered, but even he did not speak. Harrison's face hardened, his voice smooth as glass. "Scars don't matter, only results do. A horse is only worth what he can bring." "No," Ethan said, louder now. "He's worth more because of them, because he survived. Just like me." His hand pressed firm against Thunderbolt's neck, grounding them both. "You break a thing enough, it won't give you money. It'll give you nothing. But if you listen, if you care, it'll give you trust. That's worth more than all your ledgers." The words struck like a hammer against steel. Some men looked down, ashamed. Others straightened, their silence a kind of agreement. Clara stepped forward, voice trembling but fierce. "He's right. You can't buy trust. You can only earn it." For the first time, Harrison faltered. His eyes swept the crowd and found not obedience but doubt. The smile that had always cut through dissent did not come. His mouth was a thin line, his silence sharp. Cole broke it with a snarl. "Enough of this." He raised the whip, snapping it in the air. Thunderbolt reared, panic flashing in his eyes. But Ethan stood, his ground, spreading his arms. "No." His voice rang so loud it seemed to silence the crack itself. He turned to the men at the rails. "You saw it. He doesn't fear me. He fears that sound, that pain, because it was done to him before." The truth was laid bare, naked and undeniable. The stallion's scars, the boy's defiance, the cruelty woven into the past, they stood together, mirrored in the dust. And for the first time, the ranch hands murmured not with laughter or derision, but with something closer to respect. Thunderbolt dropped back to earth, nostrils flaring, chest heaving, but instead of bolting, he pressed his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder, trembling but steady. The gesture silenced even Cole. Harrison's voice finally came, colder than the Montana wind. "You've turned my men against me, boy." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "No, you did that yourself." Dawn broke soft and pale, laying silver across the valley. The ranch was hushed, as if holding its breath after the storm of truth that had torn through the day before. Ethan woke stiff and bruised, but his chest carried a strange new strength. The night's cold had not stolen the warmth of Thunderbolt's breath against his shoulder. That memory was a fire banked deep, steady, and enduring. When he stepped into the yard, the ranch hands looked at him differently. Some nodded with quiet respect, others only glanced and turned away, but the laughter was gone. What remained was weight, the unspoken knowledge that a boy had forced them all to see what they'd chosen to ignore. They had watched the scar, had felt the horse's fear, had heard Ethan call it out plain. Nothing could erase that. Mr. Harrison emerged from the porch in his usual pressed coat, but his stride was clipped, brittle. His eyes still measured, still cold, but behind them flickered something new, the realization that control was slipping. Clara walked beside Ethan, chin lifted, her defiance clear. Mary Lou, carrying a tray of coffee for the men, gave the boy a look that said more than words ever could. "You spoke truth, child. Now hold to it." The Texans had left before dawn, their promises of purchase soured by the spectacle of defiance. They wanted beasts bent to will, not creatures who revealed their wounds to the world. Harrison seethed at the loss, but he said nothing of it aloud. Profit might guide him, but he was clever enough to know the ranch had shifted under his boots. For the first time, silence held his tongue. Later that morning, Ethan led Thunderbolt out of the corral and into the open pasture. No rails, no shouting men, just sky stretching wide and the grass rolling to the mountains. The stallion's ears pricked, nostrils flaring at the sense of freedom. Ethan pressed his palm to the muscled neck, whispering, "Go if you want, I won't stop you." For a long moment, Thunderbolt stood still, the sun glowing copper along his chestnut coat. Then he surged forward, hooves drumming the earth, mane streaming like fire. He galloped across the pasture, cresting a rise before wheeling back, circling wide, and returning to the boy who had given him the choice. Dust coated Ethan's boots as the stallion halted before him, head lowered. Ethan smiled through the sting in his ribs. "Then it's us," he whispered. Clara appeared at the fence, her hair catching the light. "They'll never forgive you for yesterday," she said. Ethan shrugged, eyes still on Thunderbolt. "Then I'll forgive myself enough to make up for it." Clara smiled faintly. "I think he already has." That evening, Harrison called Ethan into the house once more. The ledger sat open on the table, columns neat, ink sharp. "You've cost me," he said flatly. "But you've also shown me something I can't ignore. You'll stay, you'll work, and that horse will not leave my land without my say." Ethan met his gaze, unafraid now. "I'll stay because Thunderbolt needs me, not because you do." Harrison's eyes narrowed, but he did not answer. He only closed the ledger with a snap, as though the page itself had betrayed him. As the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in fire and shadow, Ethan walked back to the corral. Thunderbolt waited, head high, his scar glinting like a badge rather than a wound. Ethan reached up, fingers brushing the warm blaze along the horse's face. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The boy and the stallion stood side by side, framed by the vast Montana sky. Behind them lay laughter, cruelty, and broken promises. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the hard road of survival. But in that moment, under the wide heaven that had watched them both suffer and endure, they carried something stronger than fear. Trust, fragile but unbroken, enough to light the road ahead. And as the stars kindled one by one above them, Ethan thought of Clara's stitched star in his pocket and smiled. He had found his place not given, not bought, but earned in the quiet bond between a boy and a horse no one believed could ever be tamed. If this story touched your heart, let me know with the simplest sign. Just drop a 0 or 1 in the comments. Your words mean more than you know. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week we'll bring you another unforgettable tale of courage, loss, and the healing bond between humans and animals. Stay with us. The next story may be the one that changes you forever.